The day my life changed, I was late because of a broken zipper on my laptop bag and a Tim Hortons line that hadn't moved in 4 minutes. I finally gave up on the coffee, jogged 2 blocks through February wind that felt personal, and made it into the Burrard Tower lobby with my coat still half unzipped and my badge not swiping on the first try. Standard Tuesday. I was 27, 2.5 years into a mid-level analyst role at a consulting firm that specialized in infrastructure advisory, and I had spent most of those years being exactly useful enough that no one ever thought twice about adding more to my plate. If a report needed a last-minute restructure at 9 on a Friday, I got the call. If a client deliverable had a data gap nobody caught until the morning of, somehow that became my morning too. I wasn't resentful about it, not exactly. I just knew my name got mentioned in rooms I was never invited into, and only in the context of fixing something. The elevators in Burrard Tower are slow on a good day. That morning I hit the button for 31 and stood there while the lobby filled up around me. Most people were on their phones. I was counting the seconds until the doors closed when a hand came through and stopped them. Audrey Sinclair stepped in. I knew who she was the way you know the weather forecast. Not personally, contextually. She was the firm's managing partner for Western Canada, had been for 6 years, and she had a reputation that got summarized differently depending on who you asked. Junior staff called her exacting. Senior managers called her decisive. The one time I'd been in the same boardroom as her, she'd asked a question that made a director visibly recalibrate what he was about to say. She noticed things. That was the part people mentioned most. She was carrying a leather portfolio and a phone she wasn't looking at. She glanced at the panel, saw 31 already lit, and moved to the back corner without saying anything. I turned toward the doors. We made it to the 14th floor before everything stopped. Not a slow stop. Not a gentle deceleration. The elevator gave one hard lurch, like something had grabbed it from above, and then nothing. Complete stillness. The lights stayed on, but the numbers on the panel went dark. For about 3 seconds, neither of us moved. Then Audrey pressed the door open button, twice. Nothing. She pressed the lobby call button. Also nothing. She did it the way someone does when they know it won't work, but they need to try anyway. I stepped over and hit the emergency call button on the panel. A recorded message started playing, something about the building management team being notified. Then static, then silence. That's useful, she said. Not to me specifically. Building probably had a power fluctuation. We're between floors, which means the safety brakes engaged automatically. I kept my voice even. It's not a free-fall situation. The mechanical locks are in. We just have to wait for maintenance to cycle the system or release it manually from the shaft. She looked at me the way people look at furniture that has said something unexpected. You sound like you've done this before. I haven't. I just know how they work. I paused. Also, I've read too many building safety inspection reports. Occupational hazard. That got a small exhale. Not quite a laugh, but it wasn't nothing. She called the building's emergency line from her cell. Got someone on the second try. Had the kind of controlled conversation that made it obvious she was furious without raising her voice once, and was told 15 to 45 minutes depending on technician availability. 45 minutes, she said after hanging up. Probably less. She looked at me again. Why probably less? Because they know who's in this building. That was the wrong thing to say and the right thing to say at the same time. She almost smiled. Almost. 20 minutes in, I noticed she was standing very still in a specific way. Not calm still, control still. Her shoulder was angled toward the panel and she kept her eyes on the door seam, not blinking as much as a normal person would. Her breathing was measured, deliberate. The kind of measured that takes effort. You doing okay? I asked. I'm fine, I know. I sat down on the floor, back against the wall to take up less visual space in the box. My first week here I got stuck in the stairwell on 22 for 20 minutes. Fire door malfunction. The trick is having something to focus on. She didn't sit, but her shoulders dropped about a centimeter. What meeting are you heading to? I asked. A pause. Then, quarterly pipeline review. 4 partners, 2 clients from the Vancouver Port Authority, and 1 director who sends 17 slide decks when 3 slides would do the same work. Do you have the numbers in your head or in the portfolio? She glanced down at the leather folder in her hand. Both, but the portfolio's the version other people get. Then tell me the numbers in your head. Another pause, longer. Then she started talking. Revenue projections for 2 major infrastructure files, terminal expansion timelines, a risk item on the northern corridor she'd been trying to get flagged properly for 6 weeks. She knew the data cold, not summarized, not rounded, the actual figures with the context attached. I listened, and when she stopped, I said, the northern corridor thing sounds like it needs its own slide, not buried in risk notes. She looked at me. Who are you? Adam Kowalski. Analyst, Economic Advisory. How long? 2.5 years. You're not on my pipeline review. No. She nodded slowly like she was filing something. Then the elevator gave a small groan and the lights blinked once, and she reached instinctively for the handrail. Her knuckles went white. Hey. I kept my voice low. The groan means they're working on it, that's a good sound. She didn't let go of the rail, but she breathed. My brother got stuck in one of these when he was a kid, I said. Old building in Winnipeg, an hour and 20 minutes. He wouldn't take elevators for 2 years after that. How did he get over it? He didn't, really. He just decided the stairs were worse. That got a real exhale. Something loosened in her posture. We were out in 38 minutes total. When the doors finally pried open, they were 8 inches below the 15th floor, and 2 maintenance workers were standing there looking relieved. I climbed out first and turned back to offer a hand. Audrey looked at it for one beat, then took it, stepped up, and straightened her portfolio without breaking stride. She said, "Thank you, Mr. Kowalski," like she meant it as a formal thing. I figured that was the end of it. By noon, I was back at my desk reformatting a transit demand model that had been emailed to me at 11:47 with the subject line Urgent Pulse Fix, Standard. I had my headphones in, and my second coffee finally in hand, when I heard the kind of silence that moves through an open office floor, the way cold air moves under a door. I pulled one earbud out. Something had gone wrong in the main boardroom. I could hear it in the hallway voices, the tighter-than-usual footsteps, the way 3 people walked past my desk in the span of 30 seconds. Without making eye contact with each other. A junior associate named Petra, who sat 2 rows over and had better instincts for office weather than anyone I'd ever worked with, leaned around her monitor and said quietly, "Pipeline review just blew up. Wrong version of the Port Authority projections got loaded into the deck. Numbers are off. Like, structurally off." I was already standing up. I didn't ask for permission. I went to the shared drive, found both versions of the file, compared the data tabs in about 90 seconds and identified the issue. Someone had pulled from a preliminary model that hadn't been updated after the Q3 adjustment. The variance wasn't subtle. If the Port Authority partners were looking at those numbers right now, they were looking at projected revenue that was off by enough to matter. I pulled the corrected figures, rebuilt the 2 affected slides, printed clean copies, and walked into the boardroom. Audrey was at the head of the table. The 4 partners were arranged around it. The Port Authority clients were on the screen via video link, which meant this was worse than it looked in person, because the wrong numbers had already been shared digitally. Audrey looked up when I came in. She looked at the papers in my hand. "Corrected slides," I said. The shared version had a Q2 preliminary tab linked in. "The right figures are here. I can have the deck updated in 3 minutes and resent to the call link." A partner named Bryce, who I knew mostly by reputation as someone who moved fast to assign blame, said, "Who authorized?" "Do it," Audrey said. "Not to Bryce. To me." I went back to my desk, updated the file, resent the link, and returned to stand near the door in case anything else needed real-time fixing. Halfway through the restated figures, one of the Port Authority directors asked a specific question about the Northern Corridor risk item. Everyone at the table looked toward a senior advisor who was supposed to own that file. He started an answer. It wasn't quite right. I could tell from 3 meters away because I'd heard Audrey's version of those numbers 40 minutes ago, in a stopped elevator. She caught my eye. I said the number, quietly, but the room was quiet enough to carry it. The Port Authority director said, "Right, that aligns with what we saw in the pre-read, thank you." The meeting restarted on the corrected footing and finished without further problems. Afterward, the room emptied fast the way rooms do when people are relieved and don't want to discuss what they're relieved about. I was gathering the extra print copies when Audrey stopped at the end of the table. "Adam Kowalski," she said. "Yes," she studied me for a moment. Not warmly. Directly, the way she'd looked at the data panel in the elevator, like she was measuring load-bearing capacity. "You caught the version error and corrected it without being asked. The files were both on the shared drive." "It wasn't hard to find, that's not what I said." She tilted her head slightly. "Come to my office at 5:30. I have something I want your eyes on." Then she left, and I stood there for a second, holding a stack of papers that no longer mattered, trying to figure out how seriously to take that. At 5:30 I went up to the 34th floor, which was the executive level, where I had been exactly once before to drop off a physical copy of a report that someone's assistant had requested printed in a specific font. Audrey's office had floor-to-ceiling windows facing Burrard Inlet. On a clear February evening, the water looked almost silver, and the North Shore Mountains had that blue-gray cast that made Vancouver look like a city someone had painted too carefully. She was already working at the round table beside the window, jacket off, sleeves rolled once. A stack of draft materials in front of her with margin notes in tight, small handwriting. "Sit down," she said, without looking up. "Tell me what's wrong with page 6. She slid the document toward me before I had fully processed the instruction. I read page 6. Then 5 and 7 for context. Then I told her what was wrong with it. She asked me 3 more questions. What would I restructure first? What sequence made more sense for a bored audience? And where was the argument losing momentum? I answered each one, and she either moved past them immediately or pushed back. And when she pushed back, she was usually right in a way that made me adjust my answer rather than abandon it. By 7, I was at the side table with my laptop open, rebuilding the section structure while she worked through the narrative on the main document. She didn't offer direction the way a manager usually does, with checkpoints and reassurances, and small corrections flagged gently. She told me what she wanted and expected me to figure out the rest. When I got something right, she didn't confirm it. She just kept going. Around 8:30, someone from the building's catering service left a bag outside the office door. She retrieved it without interrupting what she was dictating, set it on the far end of the table and said, "Eat something, I'm fine. The analysis gets worse after hour 3 if you haven't eaten. I've tested this." She sat down across the table from me. "Eat." So we ate. Sesame noodles from a place nearby that was apparently on her regular rotation, and green tea that had been thoughtfully included by whoever set this up, which meant she did this enough that catering knew what to pack. The city outside had gone dark and reflective. The inlet lights scattered across the water. She asked where I was from. Saskatoon originally. Moved here for grad school, stayed for the job. What did you study? Urban planning and economics. Joint degree. Took an extra year and you ended up formatting transit demand models on the 30th floor. I looked at her. For now. She held the teacup with both hands, watching me with an expression I couldn't fully read. You're not frustrated by it. I'm patient about it. Those aren't the same thing. She set the cup down. No, they're not. She paused. Most people at your level either try too hard to be noticed or they accept that no one will notice them. You don't seem to be doing either. I'm doing the work in front of me. I shrugged. The right people eventually see that, you think so? I'm here, aren't I? That got a real response. Not a laugh exactly, more like the release of one. A short, low sound that was over almost as fast as it started. But I caught it. After that night the calls started. Not from her assistant, from her directly. The first one came 4 days later on a Thursday afternoon. I was in the middle of a transit ridership model when my cell rang with a number I didn't have saved. "I'm forwarding you a file," Audrey said. "It's the draft memorandum for the Kelowna corridor file. There's a section on risk allocation that reads like it was written by 2 different people on 2 different days, because it was. I need it coherent before 8 tomorrow. I'll have it done by 6. A brief pause. Good. She hung up. That was how it started. Emails first, then texts with attached documents, then short calls from what sounded like parking garages or car backseats, where the city traffic was audible underneath her voice. I learned to have my laptop open before I answered. The assignment started overlapping with my regular work, which meant some late nights and a few early mornings, and I was aware that I was operating slightly outside my defined job scope. But nobody had told me to stop, so I kept going. After 3 weeks, a project lead named Renata asked me, with a careful kind of casualness, why my name kept appearing on senior file correspondence. I said I'd been doing some cross-team support. She looked at me for a moment, then looked at her screen. "Okay," she said, in a tone that meant it was not okay and she was filing a separate opinion on the matter somewhere. I noticed other things too. A director I'd emailed twice without response suddenly replied within an hour. A senior manager who used to seize me on things purely as a formality started including me in the actual thread. It was small stuff, the kind of adjustment people make when they're recalibrating someone's weight in the room, and it happened gradually enough that I almost missed it. The night she first asked me to stay after a working session ended, she said it the way she said most things, as if it were already decided. We had just wrapped a prep review for a federal advisory file. The rest of the team had gone. I was packing my notebook when she said, "Are you heading home?" "Eventually. Come with me first." Her driver took us to a restaurant in Yaletown that had no sign above the door, and a host who greeted her by name without making a production of it. The kind of place you don't know about until someone decides you're allowed to. "Is this still work?" I asked when we sat down. She picked up the menu. It started that way. That answer sat between us like a third person at the table. She ordered without looking twice and asked me what I actually wanted from the firm. Not the polished version. She said that explicitly. Not the answer I'd give in a performance review. I told her I was tired of being the person partners trusted with their problems in private and then overlooked in public. That I was good at this work and I knew it, and I was ready for the room to know it too. She watched me while I talked. When I finished, she said, "That's a reasonable thing to want. Is that your way of saying it's possible?" She tilted her head slightly. "I'm here with you, aren't I?" She used my line back at me without smiling, and something in my chest did something I didn't entirely have a name for yet. Dinner ran long. The conversation slipped away from work the way it does when two people have been in close professional proximity. Long enough that the edges of the formal version start to go soft. She told me about growing up in Halifax, about her first job at a firm that no longer existed, about the partner who'd taken a chance on her 20 years ago, in a way that had permanently changed her sense of what was possible to ask for. Outside, it was raining, not hard, the kind of Vancouver rain that's more mist than water, that softens everything at the edges. Her driver was 8 minutes out and we stood under the restaurant's narrow awning, close without planning to be. "You know what's strange about you?" she said, not unkindly. "Probably several things. You never try to take more than what's in front of you." She looked out at the wet street. "Most people in your position would be working every angle, reminding me constantly that they exist. I figure the work does that. It does." She turned slightly toward me. "That's what I mean." The rain moved in the streetlight. The car wasn't there yet. When she looked at me directly, in the way she looked at problems she'd already decided to solve, I didn't look away. She reached up and adjusted my collar, just one small movement, 2 fingers at the lapel, and her hand stayed there a half-second longer than it needed to. I put my hand over hers before I'd thought it through. She didn't pull back. "Adam," she said quietly. The way she said it, it could have been a warning. It didn't feel like one. I kissed her while the rain hit the sidewalk a meter in front of us, and the city moved past like it had somewhere to be. She kissed me back the same way she did everything, without hesitation, without performance, like she'd already made up her mind, and this was simply what came next. When the car arrived, we got in, and the city slid past the windows, and she gave her address in Cole Harbor. And I understood, clearly and without drama, that this was no longer something I could hold at arm's length and call simple. The following Monday, I was officially transferred to a supporting role for the Strategic Advisory Group, which was Audrey's division. The memo came from HR with language about cross-functional development and skill diversification. Nobody said anything to my face about it, but I watched people recalibrate. The junior staff started saying good morning like it meant something. The senior advisor started copying me on material they'd never thought to include me on before. Renata stopped asking questions and started watching me with an expression I recognized as someone who had updated their model and didn't love the result. The first time it really landed was during a strategy session with a federal client team. 6 people around a table on the 29th floor, talking about port modernization funding. A director named Wade interrupted me 2 sentences into an analysis I'd been specifically asked to present and said, "I think we've heard enough from the supporting staff on this one." I started to pull back. Audrey set her pen down on the table. The sound was small, but the room heard it. "We haven't," she said. She looked at Wade once. Then she looked at me. "Finish?" I finished. She backed the analysis. The room shifted in the way rooms do when someone with authority makes a decision in public and everyone else understands that the decision is already made. Wade said almost nothing for the rest of the meeting. By the end of the following week, he was no longer in the review chain for anything that came through Audrey's division. The word moved around the floor without anyone saying it out loud. A few weeks later, she brought me to Ottawa for 2 days on a federal infrastructure file. Technically, I was there for logistics support. In practice, I was in every room that mattered. On the flight, she had me review talking points and flag the 3 places where the argument had the softest footing. Over breakfast before the morning session, she tested positions against me, like I was the toughest version of the room she was about to walk into. "You do this before every meeting?" I asked. "Only when I think the other person will actually push back." That's flattering. It wasn't meant to be flattering. It was meant to be accurate. On the second night, a box arrived at the hotel for me. No note. Inside was a charcoal wool blazer, cut properly, the kind I would never have bought for myself because I wouldn't have known which store to walk into. I stared at it for a long moment and then texted her, "This is a problem." Her reply was immediate. "Wear it tomorrow." I wore it. In the morning session, the federal director we'd been trying to reach for 3 weeks asked me a direct question about risk mitigation sequencing, and I answered it in the kind of voice I hadn't quite used before. Not different words, different weight behind them. Audrey across the table didn't react. But after the meeting she said, "You sounded like someone who belongs in that room." I was in that room. "I know," she said. "That's what I mean." Back in Vancouver, the floor dynamics had shifted enough that I could feel it in the way people timed their arrivals at meetings when I was already there. Younger staff asked my opinion before sending things up the chain. One associate, a sharp woman named Petra who had tipped me off about the pipeline blow-up months earlier, asked me directly one afternoon, "What's it like up there?" "The air's the same," I said. "Sure it is." Wade, to his credit, didn't disappear quietly. He tried one more move in a file review. routing a document version that excluded me from the distribution. A narrow, petty thing, the kind of move that's meant to remind someone where they're supposed to be standing. I found out because Audrey forwarded the original email with one line underneath. Join us anyway. So I walked into the review 10 minutes after it started, took the open chair near the window, and set my folder on the table like I'd been expected all along. Wade saw me and said nothing, which was the right choice. Later in the meeting, he tried to dismiss a proposal I'd submitted without having read the technical appendix. Audrey asked him plainly if he'd reviewed it. He admitted he hadn't. She looked at him for a moment and said, "Then let's take 5 and give you a chance to." The 5 minutes were very quiet. 3 weeks later, Wade moved to a lateral role in the Calgary office. I would like to say that by spring I felt completely certain about everything. The work, the momentum, the shape of what Audrey and I had become to each other, outside of meeting rooms and marked up documents. But certainty wasn't really the thing. What I had instead was something more durable. A clear sense of what I was doing and why, without the need to explain it to anyone who wasn't in the room. What surprised me most wasn't the title change, or the meetings I was suddenly included in, or the way my inbox had transformed from a queue of other people's cleanup requests into something with actual weight. What surprised me was Audrey. Not what she'd done for me. How she was with me. Most people in positions like hers maintain a performance of themselves even in private. The composure is just the composure all the way down. With me, she turned it off. Not all at once and not easily. But late at night, after long travel days or brutal client calls, sitting at the end of a hotel bar, or in the back of a car with the city going past outs. She was just tired and sharp, and occasionally funny and honest in the way that only happens when you're not managing anyone's perception of you. She told me once, around April, that she hadn't trusted anyone at the office in about 4 years. "What changed?" I asked. "You fixed a problem you weren't asked to fix," she said. "In front of a client, without making it about yourself. That seems like a low bar." She looked at me with something that was almost affectionate. "You have no idea how high a bar that actually is." The biggest moment came in June. A major Port Authority agreement the firm had been working toward for 8 months was finally in its last stage. One meeting in Vancouver, with the senior Port Authority leadership and 2 federal observers. The kind of meeting where the handshake is essentially already arranged, and the only thing that can go wrong is the people in the room making it go wrong. Audrey was supposed to lead it. 4 days before, a conflict came through. A federal panel in Toronto that required her in person, the kind of obligation that couldn't be moved. She told me on a Wednesday evening in her office, the city outside starting to go dark. "You're taking the meeting," she said. I looked at her. "The Port Authority file?" "Yes, Audrey. You've been on this account since the beginning. They know you. The dynamics are built around you. The dynamics are built around competence and trust," she said. She came around the desk and stood in front of me. "You have both. Stop arguing from a version of yourself that no longer exists." She handed me the file folder. It was thick. Every page had her notes in the margins, tight and precise, exactly the kind of briefing document you build when you're preparing someone else to walk into a room you trust them with. "Car to YVR at 6 Friday morning," she said. "Legal has reviewed the final terms. I want a text the moment you're out." She reached up and straightened my lapel, the same way she had that first night in the rain outside the restaurant. A small deliberate gesture that she'd never stopped making. "Go show them what I already know," she said. Friday morning I was in the back of a car, moving through an empty city at 6:15, the inlet flat and pale in the early light. I had the file open on my lap and my phone on the seat beside me, and a boarding pass on my screen for the 7:40 to Toronto, which was wrong, and so I double-checked and found the correct boarding pass for the 7:25 domestic hop to a connection I didn't need, because the meeting was here, and the car was taking me to a hotel downtown where the Port Authority team was staying, not to the airport at all. I'd misread my own itinerary. First time for everything. I closed the file, looked out the window at the city in the early morning, and thought about a Tuesday in February, when I'd been late because of a broken zipper and a Tim Hortons line, and had ended up stuck in an elevator for 38 minutes with someone who changed the entire shape of what came next. A year ago I was the person partners called when something needed cleaning up at 9 on a Friday. Now I was the person walking into the room in their place.